All right, it is the top of the hour and we have a lot to go over with you all today. So we're going to go ahead and kick things off and get started. Again, welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for the US EPA Brownfields Grant Writing Strategies, Session 1. Today, we're going to start things off with myself, Maggie Bellinger, the Senior Director for the KSU TAB program and the Center for Hazardous Substance Research. Just kind of give a quick overview of what you can expect today and an overview of the TAB program. And then we'll hear from Amy Yurkovich, a KSU TAB partner. She's going to provide an overview of all of the EPA grants being offered this year, the Community-Wide Assessment Grant, Coalition Assessment Grants, Cleanup Grants, and Multipurpose Grants. Then we will have a panel presentation led by Kate Lucas with KSU TAB Assistant Regional Director in EPA Region 8 and Roxanne Anderson, the KSU TAB Regional Director for 5. They're going to take a deep dive into sections 1 and 2 of the grant application. They will then be joined by panel members Carrie Racky with Stantec and Trey Hess, PPM, to provide some additional thoughts, tips, and hints for preparing a narrative for those particular sections. Then we'll take a little break, maybe a 15-20-minute break, just so you guys can stretch. If you want to grab lunch and come back, that would be great. And then Amy's going to introduce us to the group exercise. Then we will all be put into breakout groups for the group exercise. We'll come back, have a debrief, and then we'll adjourn for the day. Before we get started, just a few quick reminders. If you experience any technical difficulties while you're on the webinar today or tomorrow, and you want to get reconnected, please feel free to call 785-532-0783 or send an email to chsr@ksu.edu, and we will try to get you reconnected as seamlessly as possible. If for some reason something happens and you're unable to get reconnected, no worries. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the event website after today. Some reminders of basic Zoom etiquettes. I think we're all familiar these days, but everybody should be muted with videos off. It just helps with bandwidth, background noise. So if you could make sure that you remain muted with your video off, that would be really helpful for us. To ensure that you get credit for attending today, get a notice and a certificate that if you'd like. If your name appears something differently than what you registered for, if you could use the participants tab to rename yourself, that would be great. We'll make sure that you get credit for attending today. And then we will be utilizing the chat feature that can be accessed there on the bottom of the Zoom bar for any questions or feedback that you may have. Please type your questions in there. Please make sure the questions go to everyone. That way we can make sure that they get addressed by particular presenters or who's ever speaking. At the conclusion of today's event, you will have an opportunity to provide feedback on today's content and the overall flow, how it worked. And we really appreciate this feedback. We use this to inform ourselves of additional programming in the future, what we did well, maybe what we could improve on. So don't be shy. And it is anonymous, so feel free to tell us all. Okay, technical assistance to brownfields is putting this workshop on today. The TAB program is a nationally funded program through the US EPA Brownfields program. It offers technical assistance to communities and tribes revitalizing their communities through brownfields redevelopment. One of the best things about the TAB program is it's free. So all the services that are provided are at no cost to the communities and are tailored to meet the specific needs. There are currently 6 TAB providers that provide support all across the U.S. At Kansas State University, we support those communities in EPA regions 5, 6, 7, and 8. So all those states that are purple there on the map. And KSU also leads the Tribal TAB effort with our partners ITEP and ANTHC, and that is a national program where they can help assist tribes all across the continental U.S. What do we do at TAB? Well, KSU TAB is really all about providing resources and assistance to help communities and tribes build capacity so they can be empowered to realize tangible change within their communities. And we do that through helping to engage communities. We support through education, such as today's event. And we have a lot of tools and resources, which we'll briefly touch on throughout today and tomorrow. What we like to say at TAB is we like to fill gaps to help support overall project goals. So whatever that might look like. In the context of maybe preparing for a grant, if you need help with your inventorying some sites or trying to prioritize sites, we can do that. Strategic planning, reuse visioning. If there's, economic feasibility, opportunity analysis, feasibility analysis for how to reuse a particular property, we can come in, complete that task for you so you can keep projects moving, progressing forward. We also do a lot of support with community outreach and input, just trying to communicate within your communities. Sometimes that's hard, or they don't want to be told what they should or shouldn't do. KSU TAB can come in, be kind of a third party and neutral party, and just help educate about the overall brownfields process. If you're trying to apply for a grant and you're want backup or backing to support that grant initiative, we can kind of come in and help with education and things like that. Here's just a quick list of all of our regional directors and assistant directors in regions 5, 6, 7, and 8. If you need help after today and tomorrow with your grant strategy, whatever that might look like, don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us and we'll be available to help. Also, request a review of your draft application for this year. It's at no cost. Again, all TAB services are free. We can review, provide feedback. Usually, and you can send an application now through up until you're ready to submit. If you submit it between now and generally 3 weeks prior to submission deadline, we usually can complete the review in about 3 business days. When we're in kind of that 3-week window of submission deadline, our reviews take a little bit longer just because we have so many grants to review. So think about that when you're planning and outlining your grant strategy as far as timeline goes, to make sure that you allow time for KSU to do a review. And my colleague Scott Nightingale will be organizing and handling all the review requests this year. So reach out to him if you would like a review. All right, and that's what I have for you today. So I'm going to pass it off to Amy Yurgovich, who will go provide the overview of all the wonderful grants available to you all.
Thank you, Maggie. As she said, I'm Amy Yurgovich. I am a TAB partner, a KSU TAB partner, and also the contact for Ohio. I'm going to talk to you today about multi-purpose, community-wide assessment, coalition assessment, and cleanup grants. As some of you may know, EPA generally goes back and forth, odd even years. One year they will offer RLF grants for new applicants, revolving loan fund grants. This year, it's the multi-purpose grant. So I'll be talking about all of those within this presentation. I know probably all of you on this call know what a brownfield is. But what I do want to point out with respect to what a brownfield is the legal definition of brownfields. Key terms: real property, expansion, redevelopment, or reuse, and presence or potential presence of hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. This is US EPA's under Public Law 107 legal definition of brownfields, and this is what is the definition of brownfields for purposes of the EPA Brownfield Grants. Just to kind of quickly summarize, states may have slightly different definitions. I know Ohio has a slightly different definition. However, the key things are it is a piece of property, it's a real property, and you're hoping or planning to expand, redevelop, or use this property because it may be run down or demolished, and an eyesore or a problem for vagrants or folks that want to trespass, all kinds of different reasons. And it's complicated by the presence or the potential presence. That means that, if you've already done some sampling in the past, or EPA has done some sampling on that property in the past, there may be sampling that clearly identifies there's contaminants on the property. However, if it's an old abandoned gas station or a tannery or a factory, steel manufacturing plant, it pretty much has the potential to have some type of contaminant. So that's obviously something that most people are going to shy away from because of the cost of cleanup and why there is so much emphasis at both EPA and the states and several other entities to help with the cleanup, identification and cleanup of this contamination so that this property or properties can be redeveloped. So why redevelop brownfields? Funding. As I just mentioned, it costs a lot of money, more money than going out to a greenfield, going out to a new property. You have to identify what contaminants are there. You have to do environmental assessment, and such as phase 1s and phase 2s, and you may have to clean up the property. There may be contamination left that has to be cleaned up. So it's not cheap. But the good thing is, as I mentioned before as well, there's often funding available at the state and local level, as well as the federal level, that we're talking about today. And your state, probably all states have something a little bit different. Some are better than others, or I should say more money than others, but almost all states have some type of creative way to helping fund this or do in-kind services such as assessments to help that. And one good thing is there's infrastructure there. They've already placed infrastructure. It may need to be updated or improved, or in many cases it's there and for the use. So you save money in that way. You reduce the amount of impervious surface expansion, at least brownfields do in the nation, by 80%, which is huge. Getting rid of a lot of impervious surfaces and maybe using some smart groundwater, or surface water infiltration systems can help a lot. I know a lot of people do mention, and I hear this a lot in Ohio, well, what is this really going to do? You're bringing this business in, but they got a tax abatement. So we're not getting any extra taxes. It's not helping our community. Well, it is, because you're going to bring workers in. So you're looking at payroll taxes. Maybe workers are moving into the area, and you're looking at property taxes. And there's often satellite businesses, whether they're supporting the workers or supporting the business itself with parts and labor. And those bring in taxes as well. So even though there might be an initial abatement, there's a lot of good that goes on from redeveloping brownfields. And probably just as important, we preserve the community character and history. So oftentimes these buildings, if they haven't been demolished, may be historical, may be may be fixed up and be around for a long time more. So first thing you want to think about when you're thinking about taking a property or properties through, assessment and cleanup, and particularly applying for an EPA grant, is, are you eligible? Is the site eligible? So does it meet brownfields definition? We've obviously talked about that. Is it subject to any environmental enforcement actions? Oftentimes talking to your regional contact at the EPA region you're part of, or talking to your state contact is very important, and tracking that down. That could be a big problem, or it may not. So working with the regional and the state environmental folks will help. Do you own, or have you owned the property? If it's in cleanup, we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's a must that you own the property by the time you submit your grant. The property that you're going to, or properties you're going to clean up. And if you've owned it for a long time, there are questions you're going to ask, or you can talk to your state or regional environmental folks. And those are things like, have you leased it out to a business where contamination may have occurred? Have you, what has this property been used for through the history? Who's owned it in the past? That sort of thing. Because a lot of this goes into the chain of title, which, often, if that's problematic, can affect eligibility. How did you acquire the property? If a city got it in an auction, or basically in a tax foreclosure, have they done a phase one on that property? That's very important if you want to use the brownfield prospective purchaser defense. So those are the questions you want to ask, or ask your experts at the state and federal level. Have you caused or contributed to any contamination on the site? That is a big thing, because even though doing a phase one is part of the brownfield prospective purchaser requirements, you also have to make sure that you're not causing or contributing to the contamination on the site after you own it. What can be addressed? Hazardous substances, petroleum, asbestos and lead-based paint, big in older neighborhoods, particularly if you're dealing with those, mine-scarred land, and controlled substances. So talking a little bit about the different grants, the assessment grants, the cleanup grants, and the multi-purpose grants. Assessment grants, and we'll talk about each type. They're state and tribal. These won't apply to most of you, but may if we have state members or tribal members on the phone or on the webinar. Community-wide, which is very popular, and coalition assessment grants. They're going to pay for environmental investigations, phase ones and phase twos. And they cover sampling and analysis of environmental media. Not only that, you can do things like inventory, and you can also do cleanup planning activities. You can't do actual cleanup, but planning toward those cleanup activities is eligible under the assessment grants. Cleanup grants, you want to make sure you know your contamination. We'll get into that in a little bit, but you must have a complete phase two. And by that, I mean, you don't need to do any additional sampling. Now, we all know that we may think we have a site that has been totally well characterized, and there are, occasions, generally not frequently and hopefully, where you dig in and find, manufactured gas plant equipment or things like that. But for the most part, what EPA is looking for is making sure that you have characterized the site to the best of your ability, and that the state agrees with you. And we'll talk a little bit about how they demonstrate that in a minute. So you want to make sure that's taken care of. And if it is, and you receive the grant, you can do remedial activities. That does not include any extra sampling, but it does include confirmatory sampling at the end of the day. And it can also pay for implementing engineering and institutional controls like deed restrictions, and clean up any kind of cleanup equipment, that sort of thing, that is going to be left at the site and monitored. Multi-purpose grants. They're designed to support a wider range of brownfield investigation activities. So you can do assessment, you can do cleanup. There's a lot of planning that is involved because these are focused in an area, generally a target area, or maybe it's an industrial corridor or a main street. This is more of a, rather than like in cleanup or assessment, maybe you're looking at a couple of sites in a target area. Here you're looking at the target area as a whole, and you're making plans of how you want this assessed, cleaned up, and redeveloped. That's not to say you don't do this in the assessment and cleanup grants, but the nice thing about the multi-purpose is you can plan it with the idea of we're going to do assessments here. Here's our keys to do cleanup in order to meet the overall plan that you have for that area. Assessment grants. I'm not going to talk much about this slide. I've already kind of covered this, but you can conduct cleanup and reuse planning to align brownfield development goals with your community vision and determine if cleanup is necessary. You can do things in addition to inventory, such as site reuse assessments, market studies, and revitalization plans. So let's get into the specifics. Community-wide assessment grants. These are way back in the history of EPA giving out brownfield grants. They used to focus on maybe they did have a site-specific grant for assessment. But what they found out is what really works better is for the community to identify a target area or areas and have grants that have the funding to do multiple sites. And that is what your community-wide grant is. It is the applicant is generally a city, but it can also be a county or a larger area or a nonprofit. But you're going to target certain areas or an area and target priority sites within that do assessment. Applicants can request up to $500,000 this year, and they're expecting to award about 70 of these grants. That's the anticipation. And the period of performance, as it has been in the past, is 4 years. So the grant money does need to be spent and the project done within 4 years. Coalition grants. One of the main reasons these were developed was to help those communities or those nonprofits that are smaller or newer to the brownfields arena, to help them actually do some brownfields work and get that experience under their belt. So you have a lead, which is often a county. It could be a regional redevelopment district or anything else in your state that would be eligible, and they are going to take the lead. So they will be the overall managers of the grant and all the activities and requirements under that grant. However, they will be working in close quarters or closely with the nonprofits and smaller communities within that coalition. And the idea is to, as I mentioned before, get those smaller communities up to speed, knowing what they're doing, so they can go out and maybe get a community-wide grant in the future if they want to do more assessment or need to do more assessment, or a cleaning grant. So they understand what is all involved in that. So it's a really good opportunity to get some work done by a lead, and they can also kind of handhold but teach less experienced communities along the way. Lead entity of the coalition must be a state, county, regional council, general unit, purpose units of government, a Native American tribe. They can ask up, it's a pretty big grant, $1.5 million will be available. You can ask up to that in this fiscal year. And they anticipate awarding approximately 39 of these grants. Community-wide assessment grants for states and tribes. I'll go over this very quickly. I know there are some states out there. Ohio has taken advantage of this and received a couple assessment grants in the past. They're very nice. They're available to states and federally recognized tribes and native corporations in Alaska. They can ask up to $2 million. And so generally what the state or the tribe, what they will have, and this will probably be the case this year in the guidelines as well, they will identify at least 3 target areas. And these are often counties, but they also could be cities that are really in need of some additional assessment, some additional funds to keep things going. These might be communities that have really made some important strides and good strides in working with the state in brownfields, and they need to keep on going. So they might be the focus of that. So they, again, I mentioned they were $2 million, up to $2 million. They anticipate awarding 18 of these grants this year. And the period of performance is a little longer because you're focusing on at least 3 target areas, sometimes more. So it's 5 years. Cleanup grants. And as I mentioned before, these are to fund and remedial activities, engineering and institutional controls, preparing the site for reuse. So when you apply for a cleanup grant, one of the submittal requirements is your assessment of brownfield cleanup alternatives, or ABCA. And that's a general plan where you're looking at a number of different alternatives and then deciding on or recommending what is going to be best for cleanup as far as the cost, economic issues, but also environmental issues. This is not a detailed cleanup grant plan. So if you do get awarded that cleanup grant, you can use it to prepare very detailed cleanup plans, so working with whatever environmental professional you contract under RFP, you will, there'll be identified areas, there'll be things they're doing at those identified areas, soil removal, they may be looking at indoor air, different things like that. So you're going to get into those kind of details and exactly how that's going to work in the end. They can also, including soil excavation and tank removal and things to deal with the contamination on the site. Often in the buildings, you may have asbestos or lead, and that can be covered under it, as I mentioned before. Applicants there's 2 categories this year instead of 3 in the previous year. And they're looking at smaller cleanups around $500,000 or a little or less. And then big cleanups, because they will also be awarding $400 million in FY26 for some of these grantees. They're expecting actually a lot compared to the smaller ones. They're anticipating awarding 10 the $500,000 grants, 26 of the $4 million grants. And as I mentioned before, these funds cannot be used for site investigation. That has to be done. They can be used for confirmatory sampling, but basically they want proof that your full assessment is done. And I'll get into that right here. With cleanup grants, there's quite a few things that you need to be doing up front. So if you're thinking about this right now, you want to be actively looking at these requirements so that you're ready to go when you start writing your grant. As I mentioned before, the site must be owned by the applicant at the time they submit the grant application. So that property must be owned, and it must have a phase 1 and phase 2. It must be eligible for funding. Again, there are a lot of different things that could make it eligible or ineligible, including enforcement, chain of title, what a leasee may have done in the past, those sorts of things. So again, contacting your EPA regional contact or your state or your state contact is essential. You want to have a complete ASTM phase 2 or equivalent. Oftentimes the state voluntary cleanup programs phase 2 assessment will be considered an equivalent. There are some other assessments that also are considered equivalent, and depending on the type of property. So that must be conducted at the site. Not only that, it has to be submitted to the state environmental agency, and they need to write a letter indicating that there is a sufficient level of site characterization for the remediation work to begin on site. And as I mentioned before, that is just so that you're not caught up, and EPA doesn't want to be caught in a situation, whoever ends up being your grant administrator, where there's a lot of phase 2 type sampling that still needs to be done, and they cannot pay for that. You would have to find the money for it. So they want the state to be comfortable, as well as whoever is completing and writing your phase 2 investigation. There's always a chance that you'll hit a bunch of barrels that nobody expected, but that is hopefully going to be very much not the norm. So the community notification requirement must be met as well. So ahead of time, before you submit that application, you need to public notice it in the paper, and the public notice needs to meet some certain requirements. It has to be published no less than 14 days before you submit the grant. And within that time, you're going to need to have public meeting, as well as have your ABCA at the library or another public space where it can be reviewed prior to that public meeting. So if you are thinking about cleanup, getting your ducks in an order at this point in time is really important. So then we move on to multi-purpose grants. Again, these haven't been issued since the FY24, I believe. Yeah, 23 grants that were written in 2023. So they can carry out a number of different things. This is really nice because they can do assessment. They can move these assessments from phase 1 to phase 2 to cleanup on a particular site. Some sites they can go straight to cleanup. They've already done all their assessment activities and things like that. Again, as I mentioned, the industrial corridor, Main Street, a particular neighborhood that might be industrial and residential, the industrial facilities have mostly shut down, are key areas where someone who receives a multi-purpose grant or is going for a multi-purpose grant they're going to want to focus on, and they're going to want to develop that overall plan for revitalization. So they're looking at that whole area. If they haven't already, they're going to inventory sites, prioritize sites, and have a methodology for prioritizing sites, conduct assessments, develop cleanup plans and reuse plans for brownfield sites, and carry out cleanout activities, much the same as a cleanup grant. They can ask for up to $1 million for this grant. And the period of performance, again, because you're looking at kind of an overall plan and looking at a number of sites, is 5 years. They expect to be awarding 20 of these this year, so those will be pretty competitive. And that is all I have for today. Thank you for listening, and hopefully feel free to put any questions you have for me in the chat box. And right now I'm going to pass this on to Kate Lucas, who is an Assistant Director for Region 8 with KSU TAB.
Thanks, Amy. Before I get started, there is a question in the chat, Amy, asking about what the approval process is for states without a VCAP program or a VCP program.
Oh, I'm sorry. Could you say that again?
Yeah, so there's a question in the chat about the approval process for states without a voluntary cleanup program.
Yeah, it would be if the state doesn't have a voluntary cleanup program. I know most do, but if they don't, you would want to probably talk to the state's like Superfund or cleanup program, not necessarily voluntary, because they're going to probably have at least one person that has already been, doing this type of work, and they would have them review the phase 2, because a phase 2 assessment is something that isn't just used. It may be go under a different name in different cleanup programs, but a phase 2 is something that every state is going to kind of know what is required under it, and can adequately review it.
Yeah, and another recommendation would be to talk to, you can reach out to us. We have kind of a record of communities within your state that have received these grants in the past. We can at least give you the names, if not the contact information, of folks within your state who have navigated through this process before. One of the things that's really great about brownfields is that I think there's a lot of peer-to-peer learning. So we can definitely help make those connections as well.
Absolutely. And also once the grant, the NOFO comes out, usually in section 7, there will be a section, usually section 7, there will be a list of your regional contacts, and along with TAB, you can also talk to them, because they're going to know and be able to recommend who you should talk to at the state.
Yep. Okay, and then I see another question in the chat from Geneva asking if grants will be open for application in FY27 as well. Geneva, I'll get to that, but just to briefly summarize, the answer is probably yes, but we don't know anything for sure. Obviously, there's been a lot of changes in federal funding over the last few months. So that's, as far as we know, the answer is yes, but there's no guarantee at this point. The one thing to note is that funding amounts will likely be lower, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail here in a minute. Okay. So, okay, great. I'm able to control those slides, which is great. Okay, so as Amy mentioned, I'm Kate Lucas. I am the Assistant Director for KSU TAB Services within EPA Region 8. So I'm located in the Mountain West. But all of this information here today will be applicable to all the attendees on the call. So before we get into a kind of deep dive of section 1, we'll be going over a few kind of background information things, some things that Amy kind of talked about briefly, but just things that you need to be aware of now, and some things that are good to be thinking about and start working on even before the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, as you'll hear us call it, is released. And I will note that in both kind of this background info section and then the section 1 overview, I will be joined by panel members. I know one of them was having technical difficulties this morning, so the panel members may end up being the panel member. So Carrie, if you want to, actually before we dive into this, just turn your camera on and say hello, introduce yourself. And I would say, you know, I'll try and stop every couple slides and give you an opportunity to weigh in.
Sure. Sometimes my camera is a little slow to click on, so sorry if you're just seeing a blank screen. But yeah, I'm Carrie Racky. I'm with Stantec, and I'm based in Portland, Oregon. So Region 10, which is outside of KSU Tab's area, but I do a lot of work in Region 8. So yeah, happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. Just so I don't miss you, Carrie, if you have, I looked through where you had comments, but if I miss anything, if you'll just like raise your hand and I'll pop it over to you.
Sure.
Okay, so first things first, do you need an EPA grant? And so these are some of the questions to be asking yourself in the next week or two before that NOFO gets released. Thinking about the scope of your brownfield problem. We work with a lot of communities in Region 8, a lot of smaller communities that maybe only have 1 or 2 sites that they need to assess and clean up. And in those situations, it may be more appropriate to work with a state or EPA region to get a targeted brownfield assessment as opposed to the small community managing a very large brownfield, EPA brownfield assessment that they couldn't possibly spend. So that's a great kind of first question is, do you really need at least, you know, a couple $100,000 to apply for and to implement within your community? If you have multiple eligible sites, the answer is probably yes. If there's only one site, then the answer is maybe. And we can talk about other resources that would maybe be more appropriate. Something to think about, again, before the application is released is thinking about identifying your target areas and maybe developing a brownfield inventory or just even dropping flags on Google Maps where you know that there's sites that need work, that need assessment. And that can kind of help you define where that scope of work would be implemented, where you should be awarded. And then in addition to, you know, do we need it and where do we need it? The answer is the question is, what do we need? Is your community's need primarily for planning? Is it for assessment? Is it for cleanup or is it for something else? And answering those questions can help you identify which grant is going to be most appropriate for your community. Some other logistical questions to consider before you begin drafting a grant application. Does the timing of the grant work for the needs of your community? One of the things to note is that it typically takes at least a year between when the application opens, let's say the NOFO is released September 10th, which is a total spitball random number or date, but typically grant funding does not get awarded until roughly October of the following year. So you'll start working on your grant in September, typically submit in November. The grants get awarded in May or June. And then over the summer, you'll spend time coming up with your work plan, getting a consultant, kind of doing all of the logistical background things. And you don't typically start working on your grant until typically October. Oftentimes it will be even, you know, the early few months of 2027 before you would really be able to start implementing your grant. So if you have an immediate need for assessment or cleanup, that's something that is worth a conversation to see if there's other types of funding that could be available that could meet your needs that would be available on a more immediate basis. Another thing to think about is whether your organization has the capacity to manage an EPA grant. These grants do require quite a bit of legwork in terms of administration, financial reimbursements, contractor management, and those are all things that take staff time and effort and therefore money to manage. And if your organization doesn't have the capacity to manage the grant, are there ways that you can expand that capacity or are there other opportunities that are going to be a better fit? You may also be able to partner with another entity. I will say those coalition assessment grants that Amy mentioned are typically less competitive than the community-wide assessment grants. So those are, you know, those are a good avenue to explore if you don't think your community has the capacity to implement a brownfield grant. There may be a regional organization, an economic development organization, or your county or some other council of governments that would be able to partner with you to apply for one of these grants. And I'm most experienced with Region 8, but in my experience, the state brownfields agencies love to talk to communities. They're very helpful, and they have resources for communities if you are not ready to develop or apply for a brownfield grant. I do see a question in the chat asking if we will be speaking about EPA Brownfield Job Training Grants. The answer to that is no. The EPA Brownfield Job Training Grants are offered on a slightly different application cycle. Those, I believe, does anyone know if those are open or did that solicitation close already?
They are open until,
open.
until toward the end of September.
Okay.
And I can post in the chat some training links for that, because as Kate noted, we won't be covering it during this webinar, but I'll still post links.
Yes, and the job training grants are also, the technical assistance provider for those grants is a different organization from KSU TAB. So we actually, we all work together, but that is technically under the purview of a different organization. And yeah, Kristen, if you could just drop some information in the chat, that'd be awesome. Okay, some other things to consider. These aren't essential, but it is something to start chewing on at this time. Thinking about, one of the things in assessment grants and cleanup grants, they want to see your ability to implement that funding and then leverage the brownfields funding for economic development purposes or, construction purposes, partnering with the developer and actually getting a site returned to productive use and not just getting it assessed or cleaned up and sitting vacant. So think about whether your community has developed any recent plans or collected any data that could help potentially inform your grant application and take it that next step after the site is assessed or cleaned up. As I mentioned, target areas, think about kind of the geographic boundaries of those areas. There's not any real restrictions on where you can draw those lines. So, if there's, a corridor, even if it isn't directly corollary to a specific census tract or block, you can still kind of define the target area as is most appropriate based on the demographic or the typological or the or topographical or just kind of network of streets within your community. Now is also a great time to be thinking about community-based partners, including neighborhood organizations, churches, nonprofits. Within that target area. These partners aren't necessarily going to be implementing the grant, but they can be very helpful in conducting community outreach and soliciting feedback, particularly if you're planning to do any planning work with your brownfield grant. One of the things to think about is whether the lack of funding is affecting your community. And this is something that is touched on. We're going to touch on in a little bit more detail. I think in the section 2 overview. And we also, it's good to think about whether you would be able to get funding for this work through other sources if brownfields are not available. Oops. Oh, that worked. Okay. Okay. So
Kate.
Go ahead, Carrie. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, of course. And I have, a couple of things that just kind of came to mind when I was looking through the slides, and they might not be in exactly the right sort of location, these comments, but I wanted to throw them out there. So so reuse planning is one of the things you can do as they mentioned with an assessment grant, and there's guidance on the EPA website about sort of what that can look like, but I think it's sort of the unsung hero of assessment grants in a lot of ways. They're very flexible. It can be I kind of think of reuse planning almost in 2 buckets. Like it can be sort of visioning and community engagement and concept design of what a site could look like or what a corridor, could look like, or it can be very technical. It can be things like, infrastructure analysis and, to a certain degree, some engineering studies are eligible. So that is a really valuable thing to explore as part of the scope of your grant application. So I wanted to throw that out there. So really kind of dig in there because I've been doing this work for a long time, and there's been very few times when we've taken an idea to EPA and said, can we use grant funds for this kind of reuse planning effort, and they pretty much always say yes. If it's in the sort of in the spirit of advancing reuse in a brownfield impacted area or of a brownfield site, it's probably eligible. So explore that. And then the other thing I just wanted to throw out there is to make sure that you read the guidelines really carefully, especially if you're considering a coalition grant, because there are pretty complex rules about who can apply based on, what type of municipality are you, or if you're, an economic development district, are you the right kind of organization? Do you meet the definition of an eligible applicant? Have you applied for a grant before, and how does that impact your eligibility as a lead applicant and a coalition partner? There are rules about documentation that you need to provide as an applicant that can be kind of, complex and important. There's rules about if you have an existing grant, how much you have to be drawn down. So all that is just to say, get really familiar and maybe go through them with your KSU tab partner or with an EPA project officer so that you really understand the nitty gritty, because they have gotten more complex over the years.
Definitely. That's a great point, Carrie. And yeah, if you I would recommend reading through last year's NOFO just to get an idea of the kind of things that they're asking for in terms of those logistical requests for eligibility and the logistics of grant applications. I would say read through last year's NOFO and then reach out to us. We're more than happy to walk you through and talk you through some of those more technical details, because it does get very confusing. But we've worked with these for several years, and we are, we're happy to help you guys interpret the guidelines so that they're a little bit more clear. Okay, so we are coming up on the fiscal year 2026 Brownfield Grants. This is the last year of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or Bipartisan Infrastructure Law funding, IIJA or bill funding. And with this funding, the appropriations for brownfield grants were increased by roughly threefold from their quote unquote regular appropriations. So as far as we know, and again, this is more than a year out, and things are changing all the time. But at this time, we are anticipating that in FY 2027, the EPA Brownfields Grant Program will only receive their regular appropriations, which means we have about $90 million in grant funding per year versus $270 million, which is what we've had the past about 5 years. With that, the grants will likely be returning to smaller amounts. Historically, community-wide assessment grants were limited to $300,000 per grant. Cleanups were limited to $500,000 per site. Although there's some exceptions, you can get waivers, but I think the total max was $650,000. And there was a 20% cost match. Same with multipurpose. I believe multipurpose was $800,000. You were required to provide a $40,000 match. And then with revolving loan grants, you would also be required to provide matching funds. So we are anticipating that this year's grant round will be fairly competitive, just because it is that final year of the IIJA levels of funding. And again, next year, we're not exactly sure what things are going to look like. Okay, so if what you've heard so far has not discouraged you from applying, then it is time to be thinking about go time. As far as we know, the FY 2026 guidelines will be released in September. They're typically released sometime between, I would say, September 8th and 22nd. But there's definitely a week or two's worth of flex timing between those. The NOFO is typically open for at least 60 days, but sometimes it's less than that. But typically it is about 2 months after the grant the NOFOs are published. While we're waiting for those guidelines to be released, you can review last year's grant guidelines and FAQs. They are posted on the EPA's website on this link or via this link. MARC grants were last offered for FY 2024, so those are still available, but I believe they're in a different section. So if you can't find them, just scroll a little bit further down. The KSU tab website also has a resources webpage, and you're able to find copies of successful grants from previous years. You can narrow it down by year, you can narrow it down by application type. What we recommend is, if you're having trouble identifying a grant, reach out to us and we can send you specific grant applications that are similar in size or location or project to your community, and you can kind of use those as inspiration to begin kind of collecting ideas for your grant. We also have an online tool called Tab EZ, which is a grant writing assistance tool. Really what Tab EZ does is takes the guidelines in the grant, kind of the prompts for what you're supposed to write about, and ties it to the evaluation criteria for that section. Whereas in the PDF of the guidelines, you kind of have to flip between about 20 different pages worth of information to see those. There's no way to see those side by side. So Tab EZ helps you look at those side by side. I will note, because I had some questions last year, Tab EZ is not where you submit your grant. It doesn't help you write the grant. It just helps you kind of consolidate the information that you need to write the grant. You will still need to export what you've written in Tab EZ to a Word document or a PDF and send it to KSU Tab if you'd like us to review it. We can't see your grant in Tab EZ, and the grants are submitted through grants.gov. They're not submitted through the Tab EZ website. Okay. So a very hot tip that you can start working on today, tomorrow, in the next few days is your grants.gov login. If your community applies for a lot of grants, this is something that you likely are on top of already. But if you are a smaller community who doesn't apply for a ton of federal grants, this is something that you need to set up in the next few days. It takes time to get get like a new profile set up within grants.gov. And this is absolutely not something that you can do 2 weeks before the application deadline or, the night before the application deadline. Now is the time to get started in grants.gov and making sure you have all of the correct information and the numbers and the representatives and the contact information within grants.gov is up to date and correct. I do believe that grants.gov has a really great and robust technical assistance program. So if you're having issues within grants.gov, you can reach out to them. And I believe that they're very responsive and helpful in terms of helping you figure out, any information that you're missing and the logistical challenges of getting that set up. Within grants.gov, you need to confirm your UEI, that's your unique entity identifier. And then you need to make sure that you're registered with the System for Award Management, or SAM, and make sure that your account is active. You also need to make sure that your authorized organizational representative profile is up to date. There's a lot of turnover in communities. There can be a lot of staff turnover, and you need to make sure that that AOR is somebody who still works for the city or town or county, wherever you're located. And that is a person who submits the application. So if your AOR is, somebody that you don't know personally, you need to make sure that you have that relationship with them and you're able to, they're going to be able to submit the grant within the appropriate timeline for before the deadline. Okay. Before you start writing your grant, another great thing to work on now is contacting your regional EPA office or KSU tab and asking about grant strategy and assistance in identifying your target areas. We're happy to sit down and have a call with you and talk about where your brownfield sites are concentrated and where you should kind of draw those target area boundaries. The EPA is not able to assist with kind of content questions of your grant application once the NOFO or the guidelines are released. But you can contact KSU TAB at any time, and we're happy to help you kind of develop a grant strategy. That being said, the EPA can answer questions about eligibility for grants at any time, but just it's kind of that content of your grant application that they can't provide assistance with. As I mentioned before, now is a great time to review last year's NOFOs for assessments and cleanup grants, or the 2 previous years for multipurpose grants. You can also set up a KSU TAB, TAB EZ profile and just kind of play around with that and get comfortable with the platform before you start writing your grant. Carrie, anything to add on those slides there?
Nope, I was gonna chime in when you
Okay.
get to kind of the types and the scoring and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so Amy covered this briefly, but this is a nice little summary of each of the different types of grant that are being offered this funding round. This doesn't include job training just because it's on a different application cycle. But again, we've got community-wide assessment grants up to $500,000, coalition up to 1.5 million, community-wide assessment grants for states and tribes, or CWAG street grants, as we call them, available in amounts of up to $2 million, up to $1 million for multipurpose grants, $500,000 for cleanup, and then there's the second cleanup tier, which is up to $4 million. And I will note here that you do not have to request the maximum amount of money per grant. If you have a cleanup project that's $1.5 million, you can request $1.5 million. If you have a cleanup project that costs $250,000, you can request that amount of money. You don't, if you're a smaller community and you don't think you can spend $500,000 on an assessment grant, you can request a $250,000 assessment grant. Really, however much money you think is practical for your community. These project periods are a bit longer than they are under the standard appropriation. So we expect that next year it is likely that those project periods will also get a little shorter. Historically, assessment grant implementation project periods have been 3 years. They've been extended since there's more money, but that's something you can expect to fluctuate a little bit for next year's funding as well. Okay, and then we'll get into this a little bit more when we get to our exercise, but here we have the ranking criteria for the different sections of the guidelines. So there's 4 main sections. Today we're going to be talking about the first 2, and it does vary between the type of grant that you're applying for, exactly how many points per section you're able to get. The guidelines are largely the same between community-wide assessment grant, assessment coalitions, cleanup, and multipurpose. They're still asking the same questions, but you may be asked to provide slightly different information for like a cleanup grant. You do need to provide more specific information about the background of the site. So whereas with the community-wide assessment grants, you're talking on a broader basis, kind of within those target areas. It's not as site-specific. So you can see there is a little bit of fluctuation there between those grants as to how those points are allocated within the grant. Carrie, I know you had a comment on this one.
Yeah, I mean, and this isn't to dissuade anyone or scare anyone, but we've done some analysis of how many points you can lose total in a grant application and still get funded. And it's not many. So, and that changes from year to year, depending on, because every year they, say we're going to issue this many of X kind of grant and this many of Y kind of grant. So for example, historically, there have been a lot of cleanup grants given. And so there's been a little more wiggle room with how many points you could lose. But last year for coalition assessment grants, you could only lose 3 points total. Wow. Through the entire grant application and still get funded. And for a community-wide assessment grant, it was 4 points. So we'll talk, when Kate gets more into sort of the meat of what you're writing, I think it's really important to read and reread what they're asking for and make sure you hit all the marks as thoroughly and as truthfully, as accurately and as unique to your community as you can get it, because these are very competitive applications, and they're going to get more competitive, like Kate was saying, next year when the total funding pot gets, cut back to whatever it gets cut back to after the IIJA money has gone. So yeah, just be mindful that there are no throwaway sections.
Yes, absolutely correct. Another thing to note here, so we have been we've just kind of heard that there are likely to be some changes to the guidelines from the previous few years. In terms of tweaks, I think primarily focused around like language and specifics of what they're asking for within your grant application. We are not anticipating substantial changes to these 4 overarching sections. These are set by statute, and so these 4 main sections that we're going to be going over today will likely remain exactly the same. And really even kind of the sub-questions with each of these primary sections, we think will probably remain more or less the same. There will probably just be some tweaks to language and kind of how they're framing these questions. Okay, so I am going to dive into project area description and plans for revitalization. And then after that, Roxanne will be talking about community need and community engagement. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress, and then programmatic capability and past performance. So as I just mentioned, each of these sections has subsections, and some of those subsections have subsections. So you need to make sure that you're being very thorough. I would say keep the NOFO open, maybe print it out, or at least like the section of the NOFO that specifically has the prompts for the grant. And then, make sure that you're referring back and forth and double and triple checking. This is something that Tab EZ can be very helpful with because we have kind of a little progress marker along the left-hand side that can kind of help you keep tabs on how far along you are in your grant application. A really important thing to note is that you must answer everything. If something doesn't apply, you need to explicitly state, you asked about this, it doesn't apply. If you don't answer the question, then you could lose points in your grant application. And as Carrie mentioned, you have very little wiggle room for losing points. Okay, so getting into the project area description and plans for revitalization. Okay, so this is the overview of the section. So project area description and plans for revitalization. We have 3 primary subsections within section 1. We have target area and brownfields, and this is really your introduction to your community and the brownfields issues that you're facing, and then the sites that you're going to be focusing on. Then section 1B is revitalization of the target area, where you're going to talk about the impacts of the work that you're doing in your target area and the impacts that you're expecting from this grant that you're applying for. And then 1C is the strategy for leveraging resources. So how are you going to identify and use other sources of funding to implement the vision that you've kind of laid out in the first 2 portions of section 1. Okay, so this is your primary or your first section. And this is where you really set the stage for the story that your community is facing. And the challenges that you're facing that are associated with this brownfields, with these brownfields issues. So you are limited with, I believe cleanup and community-wide assessment both have 10-page limits. I think Coalition and Multipurpose have 12 pages, so you get a teeny tiny bit more space. There are ways to kind of play around with that, as you'll see a little bit later on in our exercise. People will play around with margins and spacing and just overall document formatting. There's ways to kind of get around those space limitations. I would recommend having your first draft of your grant and keep it with normal margins. So like 0.75, 1-inch margins, because I guarantee that after KSU TAB reviews it, we're going to have, a recommendation, add a paragraph here, add a sentence here, and then you can kind of tweak your formatting to fit in that extra content that we will probably ask you to provide. You do have to use, there's 3 acceptable fonts, I believe Calibri, Arial, and Times New Roman, and I do believe they need to be in either 11 or 12 point font. I think it's 12 point font for all of those. So that's just something to be aware of and make sure. I know, I think Microsoft Word now uses a different font as their standard font. So that's something to just be aware of as you're beginning to draft your grant. Okay. So we got a little bit off topic there. But really the point here is to make a brief but passionate case about the impact that brownfields are making on your community. And we really recommend identifying 1 or 2, and really no more than 2 specific issues that your community is facing as a result of the brownfields challenges. And it's really important for that specific issue to be tied throughout your entire grant application. And we'll get into this a little bit in the next few slides. When you're identifying priority sites, you need to be clear about why those sites are a priority, whether that's the significance of their environmental impact, their ability to be redeveloped, their visual impact. All of these things are just important to quantify within your grant application. You will also be asked to note how you will go about identifying additional sites, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so, and this is a kind of important thing to emphasize. So oftentimes the project description is not where people lose significant points, but it is not defining the exact issue being addressed that carries through the entire proposal. A poorly defined proposal will not get funded, and poorly defined means you maybe, I see a lot of grants that say, we have economic challenges, and we have health challenges, and we have climate challenges, and we have, population challenges. And these things, you need to really pick one of those things, maybe 2 of those things, and focus on them throughout your grant application. So pick housing or health or, economic investment as your theme, and then kind of make sure that everything pivots around that. And we all realize that these issues are interconnected and complex, but it is important to kind of pick one theme and then have everything else revolve around that theme. Anything to add, Carrie?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the most important things to keep in mind. I talk about it like establish your themes, because throughout the grant, you're gonna talk about what are the challenges, who is experiencing those challenges, and how you're going to use this grant funding to address those challenges. And so those challenges, the challenges, the community experiencing them, and the solutions you're proposing all need to align. So yeah, like Kate's saying, if you say in the beginning, we don't have enough affordable housing, but then when you talk about what you're doing with the grant funding, it's all focused on job creation. I mean, those are all good things, but it needs to hang together. And I think, there'll be more opportunity to get into the nitty gritty, also kind of different topic of how the grant guidelines are written. But they're in the first paragraph of what it asks you to write about in this section, there's like 5 questions buried in that paragraph. So it'll say, tell us all those things I just said, what are your challenges? Who's experiencing them? How are you going to fix it? So what I like to do, and, is highlight when there's a specific question where I need to make a point and respond to that question. And it's, it can be, they're all linked by commas in one paragraph. So it seems like one thing, but highlight in a different color each thing that they're asking you. And then when you write your response to that section, highlight your answers in the same color. So you can go and see, okay, I hit that one, I hit that one, I hit that one. Oops, I missed this one, or this is a little weak. That's kind of a good technique for making sure you don't miss those all important, super valuable points. And the last thing I'll say is I think in this section, I always look at this as like you can have a little fun in this first section, like, and what you're really trying to do with that is create a unique sense of place. So tell them about your community. Tell them about what is special there, what you love, what their community really values in that place. Because it can be really tempting to say, all the bad stuff and kind of generic statements about we need jobs and we have too much blight. But what is unique? Create a unique sense of place. It really, these reviewers are going to read hundreds of these applications and make yours stand out. You don't have a lot of space to do it. You can't go on and on about, but I read one, and maybe there's someone even on this call. I don't remember where this museum was, but there was a spam museum in this community that was applying. I guess spam was maybe developed there, or they had a big canning facility. And I thought, well, that is definitely something you want to talk about in the first section. You want to grab the reader's attention and be like, oh, that's interesting. Like, how did that come about? If there's interesting history in your community, just have a little fun there, drawing the reader in and capturing their interest.
Those are great tips, Carrie. I will quickly note, so the way that these applications are reviewed it is pretty complex. So I believe typically you will submit your grant application and it will go through its first round of review at your region's EPA office. So it'll be somebody within, Region 5's EPA office who will review your grant. And it's possible that they'll be familiar with your community, but it's also very possible that they won't be. And then after your local EPA office reviews your grant, it goes to a different EPA office or region for the second level of review. So, if you live in Region 5, it could be somebody from Region 10 or Region 2 or Region 3 that's reviewing your grant, and they probably have no idea what your community is like and, the things that make it special. So it's really important to get that story across there. And then the third level of review is basically any federal government department in any location in the US. That could be where your third reviewer is from. So it's pretty random. They don't know a lot about brownfields. They don't know a lot about you. And so it is important that you're really making the brownfields issues and your community's background very clear and concise within your grant application. Okay, so now we have a little case study here, not a case study, a little example here, just about how you can kind of thread the story throughout your proposal. So in this particular example, you are the grant writer for Tallyville, a small city of about 30,000 people. I know depending on where you are, I work in Wyoming a lot, 30,000 is a big city. It's all kind of relative throughout the US. So in your community, there was a major industrial employer and over 1,000 people lost their jobs in the early 1980s when that industrial employer shut down. And this sent the local economy into a spiral, and it still has not recovered. You've lost some population, you've lost a lot of businesses, and the town has just overall struggled for 40 years trying to recover from the loss of this industrial employer. The city is doing their best to attract new businesses, but over the years, a lack of economic investment and opportunity has led to a shortage of suitable housing. So a lot of times in these types of communities, there's plenty of houses, but oftentimes they're derelict, they've been abandoned for many years, they have out-of-state owners who are disinterested in keeping them kind of well-maintained. And your community isn't able to attract new businesses because there's no housing that is of suitable quality and at affordable prices to attract new businesses and the employees that they would need to support those businesses. Because of that economic disinvestment, your residents struggle with high rates of asthma, high blood pressure, and heart conditions, which is kind of something that you'll need to talk about in section 2. But we're going to be primarily focusing on this lack of housing as the theme for this specific grant example. And so as the grant writer, you know that there's a historic hotel in near downtown that's been vacant since the city's heydays in the 1980s. But it was built in the, let's say the 1940s, and you suspect that this building has substantial amounts of asbestos, lead paint, other hazardous and regulated building materials, and it's not going to be suitable for adaptive reuse as housing until those issues are mitigated. So this is your priority site here. You say it's a hotel. It's got, let's say, 5 stories. There's room for 80 apartment units within this building that could be offered at affordable rates. We have a developer who's interested, but in order for this development to go through, to provide housing, to stimulate the economy, we need to get the site assessed and then subsequently cleaned up in order to put this building back into productive use. So you can see here, this is kind of the outline of that thread, that theme of your grant application. So you have a lack of business opportunities, people lost their jobs, the economy kind of fell apart, and as a result, housing hasn't been maintained, and now it's sort of a vicious cycle of a lack of housing, which means there's a lack of economic investment in the area, and as a result, residents' health are being impacted. So you've chosen this housing site as a priority for abatement and subsequently cleanup, and providing that high quality, affordable housing will help improve resident impacts and also improve economic conditions moving forward. Anything to add to that, Carrie?
Not yet. You're good.
Okay, cool. Okay, so that's kind of overall how to structure this first section. We're now going to talk about geographic boundaries and target areas. This is really the first prompt within this section 1. They ask you to define the geographic boundary of your grant application, as well as your target area or areas. The geographic boundary is typically the jurisdictional limits of whatever the applicant entity is. So if you're a county, the geographic boundary is typically the county boundary, or maybe the community within which a couple communities within which the grant funds will be expended. If you are a city, that's typically your city limits. That means that's kind of where you can spend your funding. That means you, as the entity who's applying for this funding, has authority to spend money within this area. Your target area can be different from your geographic boundary. Your target area is a specific neighborhood, corridor, census block, or tract, just like a downtown. However you want to define it, there's no really spatial limitations on how big or small your target area can be. It's just where you want to focus the expenditure of grant funds within your geographic boundary. So your geographic boundary is the overarching limits of where you are able to spend this money. The target area is where that funding is going to be focused, that are most in need of redevelopment and investment, and assessment and cleanup. For cleanup grants, you will typically have 1 target area. For assessment grants, you will typically have between 1 and I would say about 3 target areas. And it really is up to you as to how you want to define them, and how many target areas you want to apply or provide. One thing to note for smaller communities, oftentimes, your geographic boundary and your target area are one and the same, because there's just not enough, geographical area to really justify subdividing it into target areas. And that's perfectly acceptable. You just need to be very clear about where your target area is.
And I'll just throw in there too, Kate, about the target areas. I think if you can align your target area that you're talking about in the grant application with a target area you've identified in other planning efforts, that makes a strong grant application. It's one of the things that's important that we'll probably talk about at some point here is, showing that it wasn't like, oh, let's just invent a project out of thin air. and apply for a grant for it, or I don't know what we're going to do, but let's get the money and we'll figure it out. Having built momentum to this point, you've laid some groundwork. So you've done some planning, you've done some community engagement in this target area. And then you can say, you know, this is how we got here, not it's just kind of sprang out of the ground yesterday. So that's, if you have that opportunity, that makes a stronger grant application.
Yeah, a great example of that is the city of Pueblo, Colorado. Their brownfield lead did some digging and identified planning documents back from the 1960s and 70s that identified they call it the Y zone, which was an area of persistent poverty back in the 60s. It really hasn't improved by much today. And so they kind of talked about how, you know, this area has experienced disinvestment for the last 60 plus years. And it's time that we really do something about that. And having so many buildings that are underutilized, vacant, and potentially contaminated, we really need to make sure that these sites are addressed and cleaned up before, so we can actually put investment into this community. We have a question here about target areas being all communities with a population of under 10,000. I know, Madeline, you're with the state. So obviously this is not something that's applicable to anything smaller than really a state organization. Madeline, I don't really know an exact answer to that question. I think that would maybe be more a question for the EPA, whether you could define your target area that way. But I think that would probably be okay. Any thoughts from the KSU tab members on that?
I'll just throw in that I kind of tend to think that defining your target areas by something meaningful like past planning or specific needs rather than population size, or sometimes it's done by census tract, and that works and it's okay. Personally, maybe it's just me being I like the writing aspects of brownfield grants, and so I like the storytelling piece, and I don't know that a population or a census tract lens just is as compelling as you know, having planning related or need related or blight related justification for calling something a target area. So
yeah,
just kind of a subtle distinction.
This is Beth. Yeah, I'm the same way here. I feel like there's what's the compelling piece about that? Population under 10,000. What's that mean? I mean, where are they? Yeah, I'm not so sure that's the case, but like Kate said, run it by EPA, see what they say.
Yeah, and in some situations, as Savannah Richards from New Mexico mentioned, or Wyoming, you know, population under 10,000 equals almost every single city within the state. So it just kind of depends on your state and the size of your communities. And again, as everyone's mentioned, making sure that you have a compelling story to go along with that population size is important. Okay, so then we get into, after we kind of introduce your brownfield challenges and your target area and your geographical limitations, we then get into the description of your priority brownfield sites. And here, especially for community-wide assessment and coalition grants, we recommend, I would say, no more than 3 to 7 total sites. Otherwise, it gets to be a very long list, and you have to remember that you only have 10 or 12 pages to talk about these sites. So it's important to focus primarily on the sites that are the highest priority for your community to assess and redevelop. The EPA knows that these are probably not the only potential brownfields you have in your community, but you want to really talk up the sites that you think have a lot of potential, especially for redevelopment. You want to talk about these sites with as much detail as possible, while still being practical with the spatial limitations. The site conditions, number of structures, environmental issues are all important to include in this section. You can talk about the potential impacts of contamination, so thinking about the age of the building, any historic uses you're aware of in the site, whether there was, you know, petroleum or dry cleaners or anything that you're aware of with the history of the site. With a cleanup, obviously, you'll be speaking in a lot more detail about a specific site. With the coalition grants, you do need to identify at least one site in the lead agency as well as the non-lead agencies' target areas. And things to include are these questions at the bottom just kind of help you identify what you need to be focusing on and why they're priorities. But it's important to to make a compelling story about either the site's significant health hazards or risks associated with it, its potential for redevelopment, its relevance to existing community plans, its location, its proximity to sensitive receptors, including both environmental and human receptors, as well as its location within, sensitive, is it close to bodies of water, floodplains, mine scarred lands, et cetera. And I would say make sure that you talk about existing structures. This is something I see a lot in cleanup grants is people talk too much about the site or they just kind of talk only about the site, but you need to mention the structures that are on the site if they exist and what the plan is for those structures and how they'll be used in the future. If there's no structures, say that. Okay, yeah, and don't list every single site. There is a section immediately after this that asks you to talk about, identifying additional sites, and that's where you can talk about, we have a list of 50 sites that we want to focus on. So if we can't get to talk about, or if we can't get to these priority brownfield sites, if for some reason the status changes, then we have an entire list of sites that is on the back burner that will then kind of reprioritize based on funding availability.
Can I just toss in real
Yes.
quickly that you might consider in that section when they're asking you for a lot of information? Again, it's one of those examples where you want to parse that paragraph and look at everything they're asking you for. But I've seen it done well sometimes where people create a table. They have, the site name and the address and the contaminants and the current use and the condition and the future, whatever way you can do it that's not making the font, 8 points or whatever.
Yeah.
But putting it in a table can sometimes A, help you organize your thoughts and B, just make it a little easier, give the reader's eye a break. And that table trick is something you can do here and there throughout. And I don't know if KSU Tab has guidance on this, but I have found that you can use a smaller font in a table than in a paragraph. So it's a little bit of a cheat. But if others think that's a terrible idea, let me know. I've gotten away with it.
I would say, don't turn your entire application into a table with tiny font, but there are definitely areas where a table is appropriate, especially in that site prioritization or priority site identification and summary. That does save a lot of space. All right, I've gotten a timing warning, so we're going to have to speed through the next couple sections a little bit faster. With identifying additional sites, you do need to talk about your plan to involve local government, community groups, and other stakeholders. The EPA historically has really liked to see a really thoughtful application of community involvement and using community input to prioritize and identify sites, especially once you've addressed those few priority sites. One of the things that we recommend for this is developing a brownfield inventory. We have a brownfield inventory tool that we'd be happy to walk you through individually. And this is something that you can start putting together now, or you can kind of work on in the next 6 months and in your grant application, say something along the lines of, Community X is working with KSU Tab to develop a brownfield inventory, and we're going to have that ready to go by the time we receive our funding. Okay, revitalization of the target area. So this is where in community-wide assessment grants and all the assessment grants, it tends to be a little bit more conceptual. With cleanup grants, it is you want to have as much specific detail as you possibly can, and not having specific plans for reuse of the site and not having secured partners for development or a vision for the reuse can really lose you points. And as Carrie mentioned, there's not a ton of space to lose points within your grant application. Again, within the community assessment grant, that is a little bit, squishier, but this is a great place to talk about, In our introduction, we talked about this lack of housing. We're really desperate for it. We've prioritized these sites based on their potential to accommodate housing in the future. And we have partnered with our county housing authority, and we're going to be identifying sources of funding. And, you know, it's consistent with these plans. And we're really focused on making sure that these sites are used for this specific purchase or use in the future. With the outcomes and benefits of reuse strategy, think about the direct impact of to the affected populations, and it is very important to quantify the benefits as much as possible. So saying things like, we expect that we will provide 350 new units of housing at, you know, 50 to 70% AMI level of affordability. That's a great thing to specify. This is not something you're being held to specifically. Obviously, you know, give them your best estimate, but if it ends up being 250 instead of 350, you know, there's no way that they can go back and, you know, take away your assessment funding from you. And I would say don't inflate those numbers, but, you know, use your best estimate. You know, work with your planning department and see with the zoning how many units you could get per piece of property. Yeah, and just make sure, you know, the data that you're providing ties back to that primary challenge that we identified in the introduction. Yes, thank you, Carrie. So yeah, think of your grant application like a business plan. Show the EPA what the return on investment will be. And I think going forward that this is something that will be even more prioritized within grant applications. So really focusing on the future benefits of this funding. How will you take this funding and turn it into 4 times the amount in private investment, or 20 times the amount in private investment? Oops, that's weird. Okay. Strategy for leveraging resources. So this is where you will describe access to funds from other sources to further assess, clean up, or reuse the sites. So think about other grant programs that your community has access to: CDBG, EDA funding, USDA funding. These are all great things to talk about because they can take a site after assessment and turn it into something that is productively reused. You can also talk about, you know, whether your community has funding allocated from their general fund. If you have a TIF district set up, these are all great ways to just show that you have the ability and the capacity to turn this underutilized site into something new that the community needs. And again, you're just using that EPA funding to close the gap and get that site ready for redevelopment.
And I'll just quickly throw really quick. So with the leveraged funding, it's not just for, you know, assessment, cleanup, environmental stuff. It's for the whole shebang. So whatever funding you're going to be able to leverage to get it to the end use that you're proposing it will have. So housing, community gardens, whatever you're looking at, think big picture.
Yeah. Okay, and then use of existing infrastructure. This is a pretty easy section. Usually brownfield sites are located within areas that already have infrastructure, you know, power, sewer, water. So oftentimes this section is just a simple, we have all the infrastructure we need for the anticipated reuse of the site. If that is not the case, then you say, we don't have existing infrastructure in this area, or the infrastructure is not sufficient to handle the redeveloped capacity of this site, but we have X, Y, and Z funds allocated for the improvement of that infrastructure. Or we are planning to apply for a USDA, you know, rural wastewater improvement grant in the next year to implement the funding, or to kind of get that infrastructure developed. Okay, we talked about this. Describe the environmental benefits of infrastructure upgrades. So you can say, you know, there is currently infrastructure in the area, but we have a lot of lead pipes. But we have, you know, this grant that will be used to replace the lead pipes, and that project will be done by the time that the assessment and cleanup of the site is completed. You know, there's a lot of ways you can kind of tweak this language to be suitable to your community. This is a great one to kind of look at historic grant applications and draw some inspiration from the language they've used for these sections. Because again, it's pretty consistent throughout all communities. Okay, and I think we can just skip this slide, but basically, you want to make sure that, again, that lack of housing, addressing that lack of housing in this particular example, ties through the entire thing. And you're really focusing on improving the housing stock and, listing resources that tie into that, making sure that, your vision for providing additional housing is implementable with other funding sources after sites are cleaned up. Okay, that's it for me. Thanks, Roxanne.
Thank-
Oh, sorry. I'll
Thanks,
turn it over to
Kate.
you.
My name's Roxanne Anderson. I am the regional director for EPA Region 5 with KSU TAB. And I work with Kristen Prasosky and Beth Grigsby, which a lot of you know. They're a dynamic team to work with. Thank you for sticking with us so far. I'm going to try and get through this section fairly fast so that we can get you on a break before our activity. See if I can do this toggling. All right, so the big question is, why do you need the money? And this is really where you can make your case. It's about people. So when you're writing about community need, think about the big picture. Why does your community need this funding? Why can't the city or township just pay for it on their own? So here's where you really want to highlight things like, example here, reduced tax revenues, maybe a larger employer shut down or moved out, which not only reduced your income tax revenues, but also then left more people unemployed. So that drives disinvestment and often creates your brownfield target areas in the first place, kind of like Kate mentioned. So if your population is small or your residents are lower income, absolutely call that out. Those are the kinds of indicators the EPA is looking for. In fact, if you don't demonstrate either a small population or a low income community, the guidelines say that you'll probably only get about 2 out of the 5 possible points here. So don't leave that on the table. Talk about an impoverished tax base. Maybe people have been moving out or property values have been dropped. We can explain how your limited resources are being pulled in other directions. For example, maybe your city had to modernize or repair its wastewater treatment plant this year, leaving no money for brownfields. So the best applications connect community need with concrete examples. For instance, one successful applicant explained that their annual budget comes almost entirely from property taxes and their population is only 7,600. And their housing and values are significantly lower than the state average. They also showed that their target area was in this 90th to 95th percentile for housing burden, which means families are spending over 30% of their income on housing and utilities, leaving very little left to invest back into the community. So sometimes it's the unexpected things. A city recently had a targeted cyber attack here that cost them $2 million just to recover their systems. That's a huge hit on their budget. And it's something that you should definitely point out. It's the kind of story that makes it crystal clear why funding is critical. So the bottom line is, don't just say we don't have money. You got to paint the picture. So show them why and show them what that means for your residents and your community. So the reviewers will be able to respond when you connect those dots for them. Okay. So the EPA wants to know who in your community is most at risk for these brownfields that aren't addressed. And they strongly encourage applicants to use and include real data to describe both your target area and your community as a whole. So don't just say we have vulnerable populations. You need to back it up with statistics that reviewers can clearly see. So to do that, I know that a lot of you who have done this before are familiar with CGIST or EJ Screen, and this year in the guidelines, that's no longer going to be a source of use for data. So we recommend using mapping tools that are reputable and widely recognized, and a lot of this is going to be covered tomorrow. So we really recommend that you come. Tools like EnviroAtlas, the Toxics Release Inventory, or the CDC places data can help you pinpoint where sensitive populations live and how those areas overlap with your priority brownfield sites and your target areas. And by pulling in that data and showing it visually, you give reviewers a clear picture of the risks your residents are facing, and you strengthen your case that these sites need to be addressed with that solid data that you're presenting them. So as I mentioned before, who in your community is at most at risk? Think about children, seniors, pregnant moms, or folks with chronic health issues. The more specific you can be, the better. So you want to use the data, show the percentages of kids, elderly, or minorities in your target area compared to city, state, or national averages. Then you want to take it a step further and explain what those numbers actually mean for real people in your community. So here's something important under Section 2A II, there are 3 categories of sensitive populations that you need to cover. Don't just identify them. You need to describe how your grant will address or reduce the threats that these specific populations face. That's what's going to make your case stronger. So, for example, here you could say something like, this grant will facilitate reduction of environmental contamination that may be associated with the target area's chronic disease rates and help lessen its significantly high health burdens. So that way you're not just describing the problem, you're connecting it directly to how the EPA funding will make a difference. Okay. So hopefully at this point you've identified your sensitive populations like children, elderly, single parent households. Now the next step is to talk about the health or welfare of those populations. So don't just say we have sensitive populations. You've got to go back and back it up with specifics like we mentioned. So reviewers want to see the data. For example, what percentage of your population is under 5 or over 65? And how does that compare to city, state, or national averages? If you say our community has more children than the general population, that's too vague. Instead, you want to show 23% of our residents in our target area are children compared to 18% statewide. That's a clear, measurable difference that reviewers can actually understand, and that also shows them that you understand. Also, you want to connect it to the grant. How will funding help reduce those risks? For example, here's the kind of language that reviewers can respond to above: abandoned and underaddressed brownfields sites in the target areas promote environmental degradation and contribute to negative public health impacts for nearby residents, particularly sensitive population. This grant will facilitate assessment and cleanup, which will help lessen the chronic health burdens that these groups face. So identify the populations, show data comparisons to prove they're disproportionately effective, and then clearly explain how your grant will reduce those threats. So here's where you can, oop, I went too far. Sorry, guys. Here you can really strengthen your story with the data in tables like we've already talked about. So you don't, you want to show it and highlight like the higher percentages of family. You can go deeper by looking at indicators that drive poverty and unemployment, like what percentage of residents in your target areas never finished high school. But you just don't, the most important part is that you don't want to leave it at numbers. You want to connect it to the opportunity. You might say something like, this grant will facilitate redevelopment in the poorest areas of the township, creating living wage jobs through planned light manufacturing businesses on our priority sites. So this is something that Kate talked about, where you're tying in and getting investment by your reviewer who's reading this and kind of helping them understand that big picture. And of course, you don't only want to talk about a specific developer or project if you actually have that commitment. But even painting the picture of how redevelopment could create jobs gives reviewers a clear link between the problem and the solution. And that's what makes this section really powerful.
Roxanne,
Yeah.
just really quickly, there's a question in the chat about, you know, should grant applications or grant applicants be mentioning race given the federal administration's anti-DEI initiatives and kind of the shift in prioritization for those areas?
And so this is obviously going to be like a more clear picture for the EPA, but we're really talking about disadvantaged communities. So if race is tied to a very specific thing, kind of like Beth mentioned in the comments, unemployment or poverty that is tied to that, yes. But just the aspect of just the The data specifically saying what type of race is there or not, I'm not really sure. I don't know if anybody else has an opinion on that. Beth?
Well, I was just going to say, just start thinking in terms of unemployment, poverty, socioeconomic
Mhm.
issues that a community is facing. And a lot of it might be they live in this neighborhood, right, that's run down due to the presence of brownfields. So I think I don't know if that's my best answer for it, and that's the way I would handle it.
Yeah, and Carrie just posted in the chat, and this is kind of what I was thinking too. The NOFA will really kind of guide that. I think we'll all be really interested once that's released of what type of language is used and kind of the direction given for the demographic information. So
And
thanks for
and
the
looking
question.
looking at the job training grant, there is some information in there, but it really is tied to unemployment. It's tied to lack of education. It's, those types of data.
Yeah. Thanks. So moving on just for the sake of time. In this part of section 2, the EPA specifically calls out 3 conditions: cancer, asthma, and birth defects. And if that's, I believe that'll still be in the guidelines. So if your community has higher than normal rates of any of these, you've got to mention it. And here's why. If you don't include at least one of them, you're only going to earn about 2 out of the 5 possible points. And that's a 3-point swing, which is enough to make or break a grant. So if you can cover all 3, that's even better. But you want to make sure to at least touch on one. The best way to present this, in my opinion, is with a table. You can do it in a lot of different ways, but it compares your target area, or if necessary, your county, and sometimes that is your target area, against state and national values. For example, asthma rates in our census tract are in the 77th percentile nationally. And so that makes disparity obvious to the reviewers, and you want to make things as obvious as possible. Sometimes it's tough to get site-specific data. Cancer specifics or statistics, for example, are often only available at the county level, and that's okay. Just acknowledge that limitation and compare it to state and national numbers. You can also look for hospital studies or health department reports, since they often gather data to make workforce or supply decisions, and those can give you a more localized evidence as well. And as always, don't just stop at the numbers, tie it back to your project. You might want to say something like, redeveloping the site will reduce pollutants, contributing to respiratory illness and lessen the chronic health burdens for what our residents face. And that way, you're not just describing the problem, you're showing the EPA how funding it will directly help solve it. So no one does this work alone. EPA wants to see who your partners are, and this is where you show the strength of your network and your ability to potentially make this grant successful on a larger scale. Partners can range from brownfield redevelopers to your state environmental agency, from workforce development groups to local universities, church, neighborhood organizations, and even groups like KSU TAB. The key is to show variety. Technical experts, community voices, grassroots groups, they all work together. But here's the thing. You don't just want to list your partners for the sake of it. Think about who you actually need to help address the challenges in your grant project, who's going to help you with community outreach, who's going to bring that technical expertise, who's going to help with workforce training or redevelopment. Reviewers want to see that your partners are relevant and that they'll really move the project forward. And if you're part of a coalition, be sure to spell out how each partner is going to stay engaged. The more specific you can be about names, roles, contributions, the stronger your application will look. When you're putting your grant together, you also need to clearly spell out who your partners are in a form with their project roles. And so you want who the point of contact is, what role they'll play in your project. For example, maybe they'll help with community outreach, planning for cleanup or reuse visioning. Whatever their strengths are, you want to show how they're bringing that expertise to the table and what aspect it's going to be. One thing Kate mentioned earlier, and it's worth repeating, is that you can actually lose points if you don't have community-based partners. I'm talking about the church groups and neighborhood associations I mentioned. They're the ones who build trust with residents. It's not just about avoiding a point deduction. It's about making sure your project really connects with the people it's supposed to serve. So a cautionary tale about a grant a colleague of mine reviewed, where the applicant said they wanted to involve women-owned businesses to help shape retail redevelopment in one of their target areas. It's a great idea, right? But they never actually listed any women-owned business groups or partners. And that kind of creates like a disconnect and weakens your case. If you say you're engaging a group, make sure you're actually going to name them and explain how they'll be part of the project. And finally, if you're applying as a coalition, you've got to be even more specific. So for each non-lead member, describe how they'll be engaged and informed and what their input will be. Reviewers want to see that your coalition members are active participants and not just names on a list so that you could get a larger grant. And that's how you show your partnerships are real and meaningful. So moving on really quick, this is an example of how you can start outlining your project right now instead of waiting until the last minute. This is, it went too far again. This is a table that I'm just on a roll, aren't I? Beth Grigsby created. And it's one of the first things you'll want to do is take a close look at your community-based organizations and who's already active in your neighborhoods, who do residents already trust, and who do they already turn to. So once you identify those groups, you can start to see who your best partners will be for the grant project if you haven't already done so. These organizations can play a critical role in outreach, engagement, making sure your community voices are at the table. So starting with them early can really help build your project out. So when it comes to community input, EPA is really asking, what's your plan for keeping people in the loop and keeping them engaged? It's not just enough to hold one meeting and call it a day. You need to be continually having a strategy for ongoing communication. And so here's the challenge, especially in small towns or rural areas. Sometimes it's hard to get people to show up. So you've got to meet people where they are. And that might mean knocking on doors, showing up at local events where people are already gathering, or just finding creative ways to make engagement easy and accessible. Think about your communication methods too. Not everyone in your community has internet access or a computer, especially in lower income areas. So you've really got to diversify, make sure information is available at the library, local radio stations, through flyers or leaflets, or even at places like community craft days or school events. The point is you need a plan that reflects your community. Show reviewers that you understand your residents and that you've thought about how to reach each of them in ways that actually work for them. And that's what makes your engagement real, and that's what makes it effective. So one of the most common mistakes I see in grant applications is when communities lay out a great plan for engagement, but they never explain how they'll actually use the input they collect. So reviewers catch that. You might have every intention of listening and incorporating ideas, but if you don't spell it out in the narrative, it looks like you're missing a piece. So here's a strong example of a local land bank, and the staff commits to keeping the community updated through their board, as well as a partnership, which includes like 24 municipalities, business groups, community organization. They say that the target community is hosting a kickoff meeting, and then they regularly progress meetings to collect feedback. And that shows EPA that engagement is baked into the process. But you need to go a step further and answer two key questions. Who is going to consider that community input? Is it staff, the board, the partnership, all of them? And how are they going to respond? Will they change their priorities based on that? Reporting back at the next meeting, what will that look like? Are they going to incorporate comments into site reuse planning? The more you can show that input isn't just collected, but actively considered and then can be pivoted or acted on, the stronger your application will be. And that's what the EPA wants to see. And that's what a reviewer wants to see. That engagement is a two-way street where residents have a real voice in the decisions being made. This slide is just a great example of how to take community engagement beyond just collecting input. You'll notice the last sentence where it says all comments received and site decisions will be discussed during community meetings. And that's the kind of language reviewers love because it shows a real plan for listening, responding, and incorporating that feedback. So I'm just going to leave it at that. You guys can look at this a little bit later, but in the sake of time, I'm going to move on. So this slide is put together. It's really about respect, honestly. Community engagement isn't just telling people what you're doing. It's about listening and using their input to shape the project. And when residents see their ideas reflected in plans, they feel ownership, and that builds trust. It reduces any resistance that you're going to feel, and it makes the project stronger as a whole. So think of it like this. The more you involve people, the more they become advocates for your project. And the EPA wants to fund projects that communities stand behind and that have a higher rate of success. Finally, I just want you to keep in mind that engagement isn't just about the application, it's about the life of the grant. So you need to build in methods to share updates and keep conversations going, whether that's through quarterly meetings, newsletters, or even simple Facebook page, social media outlets. Your story doesn't end when you get the grant. This is how you keep people informed and excited along the way. Nope. Okay, so that's it for this section. Thank you for sticking with us. I appreciate it. We have a link here for your feed plaque. Please make sure to take a moment to click it and share your thoughts at any point during the session or after tomorrow. Your input makes the session stronger and super useful for everyone here. Also, don't forget that the chat box is always open, so keep the comments and questions coming, ideas if you have any to add. Even as we move into the next part of the workshop, you can add to it. And then with that, we're going to take a quick 15-minute break to stretch, grab water, check your emails, whatever you need to do if you haven't already been doing that. But don't wander too far, because when we come back, we're jumping into the most hands-on part of the workshop. You'll get a chance to roll up your sleeves and actually see what it's like to score a grant application, which really helps you see things from the reviewer's perspective. This breakout activity is your chance to step into the reviewer's shoes, understand what stands out in an application, see how small details can make a difference in the scoring. It's eye-opening, and I promise it'll give you some great insight for when you're writing your own grants. So take your 15 minutes. We'll see you back here at, let's just do we'll do 1:17 so you guys can get your full 15, and we'll dive into the scoring exercise. Thank you. Amy, you want to go ahead and start?
Yes. Get my video started. Hello, everyone again. As Roxanne said, we are here to roll up our sleeves and work on an actual grant. You're going to be, if you haven't already, you'll be looking at a grant from Wisconsin. It's a community-wide assessment grant. And using how the scoring and the reasoning behind the scoring, you will be actually scoring either section 1 or section 2. So thinking of a lot of the things that Kate and Roxanne covered today, that those will be the things you'll be looking at, and you'll see that you've also been provided, and it'll probably, your facilitator will probably show you the section 5 of the guidelines of this grant, and so it'll give you a good sense of how to score this, and it also is on some slides that they will probably use as well. So unbeknownst to you, you've been assigned to a working group. So Hannah's going to do her magic in a few minutes, and we'll all be taken into quote unquote breakout rooms. You'll have one of us as the facilitator, most of the people that you've already heard speak today or make comments. So one of those will be on in your group as a facilitator. And as I mentioned, you'll be looking at section 1 or section 2. Tomorrow we'll look at section 3. The lead from your working group will present during the report out. I recommend, and I always ask people to select that person or have a person volunteer ahead of time. And that way, usually people are talking so much that we get thrown back into the entire group for the report out before you're ready to go, or you're still, while you're still talking. So do assign a report out person. The facilitator will ask you to do that. And as a facilitator, we will be guiding you through this exercise, and we will be the timekeepers. We will review, you're going to review the narrative ranking criteria for sections 1 or 2. First, you'll look at them individually, and then discuss and score. I usually give folks, and I will put up the application, I think others might as well, the application from Wisconsin we're looking at today. And you can read it off my screen or their screen, or if you've printed it out from the resources tab, you can also just look at it that way or pull it up that way. And then we're going to look at, after the review, we're going to start, you'll keep in mind what you want to, what you think a good score would be, but then after that, we will work as a group to score the grant for each of the categories and subcategories. And as I mentioned, section 5 is the narrative review, and that is what the reviewers use when they're assessing your grant. So you will be using that, and the language is in the facilitator slide, so you'll get a sense of what that language is if you don't have the guidelines printed out. Section 4 is actually the guidelines, the things that, say, Kate and Roxanne have been going over today for sections 1 and 2, come from the language in that. And yes, and here's our the grant that you'll be looking at, Manitowoc. Manitowoc. Yes, hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Wisconsin. Kristen, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And what else do we have in here? Oh, things to consider. So did the applicant provide sufficient detail? Is it clear? Is it concisely written? They don't repeat anywhere. That does it not match, one to the other? Like maybe in section 1, they talk about a couple targeted areas, but then when they talk about their brownfields, priority brownfields, they leave out one of the target areas where they're supposed to name a brownfield. So consistency is key there. And also providing a response to all the information requested under the criterion is key. That can lose you some points, that can lose you the grant. Make sure the applicant used the sample format tables. They are not required to. It's nice when they do, because it's very easy for the reviewers and for us to see all the information and that you provided in a table. But if they do not do that, make sure all that information that's asked for in the guidelines is provided if they do it in a narrative fashion. And as I mentioned, we are going to do a report out. I believe, Roxanne, do we still have an hour for this?
Yeah, so just so Hannah knows and everybody else knows, you will be directed into your rooms, and then Hannah will automatically bring us back. Hannah, we can take until 1:40 Central Time. So that gives us what, an hour and 15? And then that'll give us enough time for report out. And there's going to be quite a few groups, so not everyone will be sharing everything, but I think that we'll be able to go into both sections adequately, and then we will wrap up and talk about what's coming tomorrow and call it a day. So 1:40.
Sounds great. So we're looking to finish this at either yeah, around 140, you said? Or
Yeah,
240
140 Eastern, so I mean Central. So that would
Okay.
be 240 Eastern.
Eastern. Okay.
Mountain Time. Oh my gosh, I can't even.
I know. We're working
All
in a
right,
couple
but yes,
time
since
zones for the
the
most
agenda is
part,
based on
and I'm
Central.
sorry for the people in Mountain Time.
Yeah, sorry. All right.
Okay, sounds great.
I will
Well,
see
I
you
think
guys in the
Hannah's
room.
going to do her magic now, and we'll all be put into groups. And if you can turn your videos on, you don't have to for the whole thing, but definitely turn your microphones on so we can discuss.
Welcome back, everyone. Okay, so I know we had a lot of groups and some of them were kind of big. So I was going to start with like maybe the like 2 groups who want to share the most go for each section. And then if the other 2 groups want to add to that or add any comments, or if anyone has any questions, we can kind of pivot from there. So we can use the group scores. If the facilitator utilized a form, they can pop that up on the screen. If not, I can have the blank one there. And we can see how we do. So based on the ones who did section 1, do I have any volunteers for anyone who wants to share what they scored and why in each area?
Well, our group, I believe it's section 2. There's a lot of conversation. It was great conversations.
Good.
I will let Dillian speak to what they came up with.
Okay. I will pull up a different one for section 2, I guess, or
No, it's section 1,
oh,
but
okay, you said
group
section 2,
2.
sorry.
Yeah.
You did section 1?
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am.
Okay, great. And if you
All
guys
right.
are able to or want to share your screen, you can.
So how you doing, everyone? My name is Dylan. I'm an intern, a graduate intern with the city of New Orleans. And our group scored the first section. We scored a 19. We took off points for one AI because we found it very controversial with the structure and the lack of citations for those different statistics that they were bringing up. And so we scored that particular section a 19.
I think you can go through the rest of them too, Dillian.
Oh, yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. So
Yep.
the second section we scored that a 10, and we scored the final section a 5, but the first section, like I said, we scored about a 4 just because the lack of the citations and the structure of it.
And I do want to comment that what we saw was there were no references within the text as to these citations, but they had citations at the bottom of the page. So that was, I mean, a reviewer's they're not going to look at those citations if they don't have a reference point. That was it. We're short and sweet.
All right, thank you. So what was the total score then for that out of 40?
39.
39. Okay. Do I have another group from section 1 that is willing to share what they did?
Well, I'll volunteer our group. We did have a lot of excellent discussion, and hopefully Tice won't be mad at me because I also when nobody volunteers, I volunteer someone.
You,
So,
you beat me to the
anyway,
unmute button.
yeah, I'm going to share my screen because I did put the points up. So can I do this multiple? I don't know if I can. Let's see if I can put this up. I'll try. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. All right, Tice, I'll let you take it away.
Okay. So for Amy, I think we have the 4 and the 10 backwards. I think we gave 5 for that first and 9 for the second.
Oh, was it 9? Okay.
Yes, that was
Thank
it.
you. Yeah,
So
that's true, right. For some reason, I was getting it mixed up, so.
So for section 1 AI, we thought they did a great job there. One thing that we did discuss, but we didn't take a point off for, was that they never explicitly stated the geographic boundary. It was implied and minor things, so we didn't take a point off for that ultimately, but it was something that was noted. In the 1AII, we took a point off there because there was some the third site that was listed, they didn't say what development plans they had for the site. It just says and focused development. And we also noted that they discussed 3 different priorities. LMI housing was one, commercial opportunities, and then the green space trail networks. So they covered 2 of those in those first 2, but there was never any potential sites that could have been used for this green space, and we felt like that may have been a missed opportunity there, that third site that was listed. So ultimately, we did take a point off for that. Identifying additional sites, felt they did a great job there. It was very thorough, very clear plan. Then into the section 1B, the reuse strategy, this 1BI. We took a point off there and only gave 4 points because we felt like there were some consistency issues with the goals and how they were written. In some areas, they mentioned green space, others recreation. They brought up discussion of the access to the river, but there was a lot of inconsistency in those descriptions, and had several of us, myself included, commented that we actually had to read this section multiple times to make all of those connections there. It wasn't very clear and very laid out. So we did take a point off there. For the next section, 1BII, we gave full 5 points for that. We felt that they were clear. We did have the third bullet. Again, it had some inconsistencies going back to those goals and the wording. Since we'd already taken a point off prior, we felt like we would give full points instead of just kind of beating up that one issue. So we did give the full points there. Last section 1C, both sections we gave full points on both of those, 5 for each. We felt like this was one of the better written sections, and the way that it was laid out, the use of your bullets and your tables was very, very easy to read and follow, and would be easier on the reviewer. And they discussed current funding and potential funding options, even as far as the infrastructure. The infrastructure's in place, but in the event that we do need additional infrastructure, this is how we plan to fund it. So we gave full points to both of those.
We have a total of 38. Same as Beth's group.
That was great, Tice. Thank you. That was really great description. Does anybody
Thanks,
from the other
Tice.
2 groups have anything they want to add to this? Did you guys score the same? Anything you disagree with or you thought differently about?
Just kind oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say, well, our group scored 39. So you weren't quite, or point apart.
Go ahead, Lauren.
I was going to say we agree with the comments that have been said so far. Sections B and C, we gave full points to. However, we did end up with 37 total points. We were it was just, we noticed some smaller things, like for the section 1AI, we did take a point off because the geographic boundary wasn't explicitly stated. And then for the description, we felt that a point was removed there as well, just because even though they did highlight, like, here's the purpose of the sites, they didn't explicitly state why it was best suited for those sites, but yeah, that was kind of what we were thinking with that one. And then the last additional point, again, it was identifying additional sites, even though they didn't specifically offer additional sites, because it's cleanup. You usually, I think, want to outline other alternative sites. They did, however, fully outline here's how they would approach looking for other sites. So we felt that that's why we had a different point change. But overall, we aligned with what everybody's already stated.
Thanks. And what about the last group? For section 1. Anybody?
So we also ended up with 37 points total. And similar to the other groups, section C, we gave full points. But we did dock 2.5 points because I know we went with half points. It was controversial, but I said we can do that. We're just reviewing this as an exercise. We can do half points. And so we docked just again, and we felt like overall, like, they did a good job, but there were areas where we felt like a little bit more information could have been provided in the priority sites. So 1A, 2, maybe adding some information about how the contaminants are more directly related to the people that live there, or the risk to them. Why some of the priority sites were selected, as far as what was it that made them more likely to achieve the community goals or the outcomes that they were looking for. And then the identifying other sites, that's where we did just a half point off. So we did 2 points off on the prioritization or priority sites, and then half a point on the identifying other sites, just based on, they could have provided a little bit more clarity on, like, at what point would they start shifting to those, to their other sites or their prioritization. So we liked that they already had an inventory and GIS, but felt like they could have added a little bit more there.
Awesome. Thanks. You guys were strict with your points. Hopefully this was helpful for you guys to kind of see how different people look at different things, because your reviewers will grade similarly. How about for section 2? Do we have any volunteers to go through the point system for section 2?
I can volunteer our group. Well, you okay with that, Brock?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, here I wrote down our scores, so I'll share that. So we were very harsh.
Yeah, sorry.
Wow.
So for the first section, we thought this was the strongest out of everything because it tied not only into specifically what they needed to speak on in this area, specifically why this community cannot access other funding to address their needs, but then it also tied back into their story with about the way the manufacturing section just left. And so how the lack of jobs is really impacting the area. And so we thought that this section was really strong, but what we started to see, there's a lot of vagueness that followed this section. And so there was areas where they could have beefed it up a little bit. So we went 4 instead of fully 5. But then threats to sensitive populations, for here, it was just, while the data was good and there was a lot of data and the presentation of the data in the tables was really helpful, they were vague specifically in that they did not specifically define their sensitive populations. They referenced populations by names, and I don't think all reviewers would necessarily know specific groups, and specifically like their cultural traditions or anything like that. So I think defining them and why specifically like how their specific needs need to be addressed was not laid out. So we did go 2 for both of those sections, and then we skipped environmental justice for, I think, reasons that we don't all have to discuss. And then for community engagement, we combined 2BI and 2BII into one section. And so we kind of looked at it as 10 points. So we really did 5. If I did this, I would have probably done 0 and then 5 on project roles, because they had a Brownfield Advisory Council set up already, which already I think should give them it should count towards their grant, because having that support is very important to their program. But looking at the members of the group, there were no organizations that came specifically from the community. There were no community organizations. A lot of them seemed to be either from neighboring communities or from the state. And a lot of them seemed to be, businesses or private groups. And so we thought that was a missed opportunity to have an organization specific to that community and run by that community, and their membership made up by the community to serve on that advisory council. And then for incorporating community input, we did 3 instead of 5 because they did not get specific into what because they said they were going to make future plans, but we thought instead of just saying we'll do it later, they could have said, like, for example, it could look like this or look like this, rather than just kind of, again, leaving it vague. And so in total, out of 30, we gave 16. I'm interested to see if other people were as harsh.
Thank you. Do we have another volunteer from section 2?
I'm
Sorry.
happy. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Are we talking over each other?
No, you're good.
Okay. I'm happy to go. I'm sorry if you guys can hear the yard work that's going on outside of my office. We that was really shocking to see, because we thought that we scored them really harshly, but we ended up giving them, I think, 26 out of 30. So I felt like a little bit harsh, but I definitely like see where all those points are coming from. But I can just go down the line a little bit quickly because a lot of it was already covered. But 2A, I don't have anything to share. I just had this on a Google Doc. I'm sorry. But 2A.I, we gave that a 5 out of 5. We liked like the use of space, and we thought that they overall identified the community's need really well. If we're just going to go off of that, because they talked about like loss of manufacturing jobs, stagnated property values, stuff like that. The only thing that we thought could have been an issue, or at least I did, they used a singular like descriptive word. They called some of the conditions of private lenders egregious as a reason why they couldn't access private money. And I wasn't super sure if like a reviewer might, want to know what exactly makes these terms egregious and inaccessible. But we still gave them a 5 out of 5. For threats to sensitive populations, to AII, this was our lowest scored one. We gave them a 3 out of 5. Overall, we just thought that a lot of the relationships between like the health and welfare of these populations could have been spelled out better. And some of them we thought were kind of like a stretch, especially with like issues with comparing food access to housing access. We weren't sure like how those necessarily related, whether it would be something about, a person's personal use and allocation of their personal funds. Maybe some of that was freed up in getting a better housing situation or something, and they could go to a grocery store, or if the location of housing gave them better access to food. So just a lot of those relationships were unclear. The section following that we gave a 4 out of 5, kind of for the same reason that it felt like some of the aspects they were talking about earlier, especially food access, wasn't talked about again in this section. It kind of felt like a little forgotten. So we gave that a 4 out of 5, skipped environmental justice. For project involvement, we definitely agreed that they were kind of missing like a community organization. We did appreciate that they had the food pantry. One of our group members talked about how that could help, like it's reaching people where they're at. So people in this underserved community are likely visiting the food pantry, and so that probably would be a really good partner to have, but it was still lacking, kind of like a neighborhood association or a community-led organization that would really champion community members in the discussion. And for the last two sections, considering the roles and organizations that they had, we gave them a 5 out of 5 for both of them. Project roles, we thought like of the things that they have, the people that are in there, even though there is kind of lacking a community organization, the people that are in the project roles did have meaningful involvement. And then for incorporating community input, we appreciated how they talked about how and when they'll have meetings. Like they talked about having that virtually and that it had worked for them in the past. And specifically what languages they would translate their materials into for the cultures that exist in their community. So I think total that is 36 points, if we're not counting environmental justice.
Thank you. That was a good breakdown. Do we have the other group, the third group? I think we had 8, right? That had feedback.
Yeah. All right. I don't want to steal anyone's spot, but we had section 2 also, and we scored a lot more similarly to the last group, not the first one. And we also thought, we were like, man, are we too harsh? But we ended up with a total of 26.625 out of 30. And our breakdown looked like, let me scroll up. I took notes inside the PDF. So to AI, we gave them 5 out of 5. We thought they did a great job explaining how they were kind of in between grant qualified groups, so they couldn't really get funds from anywhere else. Our one note was they talked about job loss, and that job loss doesn't exactly and necessarily correlate to low income, so they probably could have cut this out and fleshed out some of the higher point sections of the grants if they needed to save space. Someone else in our group mentioned that they also could have used free and reduced lunch statistics to show their poverty/low income stats, but they didn't, which we didn't mark them off for that. That's just in case anybody needed an idea of what to use in that section. For 2AII1, we gave them 3.625 out of 5. We all voted, and then our organizer averaged them. So we thought they did a pretty good job identifying populations. We love a table, so we thought the tables were pretty good at identifying the populations. They did a good job identifying the severity of health concerns, but we were a little disappointed that they only had like 2 sentences talking about the extent that the grant addresses the issues. We were hoping to have more explanation. Maybe they could have added that one of our high priority sites is planned for affordable housing, which will expand the housing stock. So we were kind of hoping they would be a little more specific on how their specific work will address problems. I feel like that was redundant, sorry. To AII2, we gave them 4.25 out of 5. We thought they, again, did a pretty good job talking about how the grant addresses the issues. We wish they'd been a little more specific about some of the ways like the Hmong people interact with fisheries.
We also noticed that they didn't mention all three of the issues, like the asthma, cancer, and birth defects. But we figured that since there's an or in the criteria, that was probably okay. But they still got 4.25 out of 5. 2BI and 2BII, we gave them 10 out of 10. Maybe we were a little table blind, but we thought it was great that they had people from all three, three legs of the three-legged stool. They had people, environment, and economics involved, which is exciting. They also included a housing authority, I think. I think we said that. Which is good because they mentioned housing a lot. So we gave them 10 points there. We also skipped the EJ section. For 2BIII, the incorporating community input, we gave them 3.75 out of 5. It's great that they're doing all of these kind of top-down information flow activities, but we all wish they had included some more examples of how they could respond to a comment or change like a methodology in response to the feedback they get to the community. Like just something to talk about what it would look like to incorporate the comments from the community. We were impressed by their virtual meetings that they've been doing for a while, but they didn't really mention ways to like meet with people. They'd still be in person, but without like adding to their meeting burden. So like trying to glom on to meetings that are already happening in communities like Chamber of Commerce or City Council, or sending out like literal paper mailers for people who can't get out of their house and don't check their email, or putting up like flyers in places around town. So yeah, I think they got 26.65 out of 30 from us. We thought it was really good.
Awesome. I think it's really interesting to see how everyone kind of scored differently and also how everyone scored similarly. And hopefully you guys kind of learned from that and kind of got an idea on how reviewers can also score similar and different and some of the things they may or may not notice in these. I'm looking forward to the exercise tomorrow as well, because I think that'll be beneficial for you guys to see another aspect of the narrative that's a lot more tangible or specific to the items that it has versus being a narrative and playing into the reviewer's understanding of the bigger picture. So with that, I will move on. Thank you guys so much for participating. I just wanted to go over briefly what the agenda will be tomorrow. We're going to go over a few more things with our TAB program and what we offer. Lucy Stanfield will be with us from US EPA, and she's going to go over gathering and interpreting data, which will be really beneficial for those of you who were more familiar with the EJ screen and CGEST. Beth Grigsby is going to go into some helpful hints and resources and some things that are available to help you with this other than the people, because the people are very helpful. We'll have another panel presentation going through sections 3 and 4, another breakout exercise. Now this one will have the option to do assessment or cleanup. So if you're specifically interested in writing a cleanup grant, you will have the opportunity to review a cleanup grant during section 3. So you'll have that opportunity, and then we'll just kind of tie it all together and wrap up the workshop from there. So if you have not already, please feel free to fill out some feedback. You'll also have this opportunity tomorrow. As I mentioned, this is a really great tool for us to make sure that these stay relevant and helpful to you. So if there was something that wasn't or something that was, that you can let us know, we can make sure to continue being a resource for you guys. And then just final things, if you need a certificate, let us know. Make sure that you are registered with your accurate name. And if you are joining by phone and don't have a name and need a certificate, you need to make sure to email your name in. The recording will be available within 1 to 2 weeks on the website, so you can always reference that, as will the slide decks and the grants and the resources. And we just wanted to thank you guys again for participating in today's event, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. If you have any other questions or anything you want to wrap up on, you can leave a comment in the chat, and otherwise you are free to go. Thank you.
Roxanne, real quick,
Yeah.
someone asked
Oh.
in the chat about like how to join tomorrow. Same link, correct?
Hannah? It's the same
Yes.
link. Not right.
Yeah, it's the same link. I'll send out another reminder email this afternoon, but it's the same information as you got today.
And same time frame and everything.
Yes.
Yes. Yep.
I also wanted to quickly add something, Roxanne.
Yeah.
Unless it is a spoiler for tomorrow, I was going to share the score that the city of Manitowoc got.
Oh, no, please do. Yes, thanks.
Okay, yeah, okay. I just looked it up and they got 148 points out of, what is it, 160?
It was
I think so.
originally 160, but somebody brought up in our group that they didn't score the EJ sections
Oh, okay.
this last go around. So if
That
you
would have
take
been a 48 out of
off
50.
that, then it'd be out of 150.
So they only lost 2 points on the entire application. You guys are harsh.
Yeah. Right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for sharing that, Kate.
Yeah.
Thanks, Roxanne.
All right. See you guys tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.